Hello. Today we're going to look at the suffragists and suffragette campaigners during the early part of the 20th century. Now, these two groups of women were obviously very much involved in the campaign to try and gain the vote for women and equalise the rights for people in society so that men and women were both represented in British democracy. When we're looking at the suffragettes and the suffragists, there's a small number of things they can ask you about. So they can ask you about the methods of the suffragists. Basically, what did the suffragists do? They can ask you about the methods of the suffragettes. So what did the suffragettes do? And then they can ask you about the effect this had on the campaign to win the vote. So if you understand what the suffragists did and what the suffragettes did, and you understand the effects that both of these actions had, then you can answer any question that you can be asked about this topic in the exam. So what we're going to look at is the two different tactics, and then have a think about the kind of questions that could come up about these kind of things in the exam. Okay. But in order to do this, we have to have an understanding that the kind of key vocabulary. I've talked a bit before about how vocabulary is one of the things that can prevent people from accessing marks because they don't really get what a question is asking you. And so in order to kind of help you with that, we'll start off by having a very brief discussion about some key words in this topic. So the first thing, a word that you might encounter is the franchise. Now, franchise is just basically the right to vote. If you have the franchise, you have the right to vote. So at the start of the 20th century, or prior to World War I, women were denied the franchise. They were denied the right to vote. And as you've seen, the two different groups are called the suffragists and the suffragettes, and this comes from the word suffrage, and suffrage is just the right to vote or the campaign that is involved in voting. So when we're talking about suffrage, we are talking about voting. And democracy is the system that we ostensibly live under. It's a system where people vote to elect the politicians. Now, you can have an argument about how representative democracy is. You can say, well, was Britain in the 19th century, prior to the voting reforms that allowed women to vote, was that a democracy? And some people would say yes, because it gives quite a large number of people the vote, and some people would say no, because, again, a huge number of people were denied the vote. So a democracy is where people have the power to elect their own politicians, but the extent to which a country is a democracy is a debatable question. Then militant. Now, militant is quite an important word in this topic because militant is when you use violent methods to achieve an aim. So if you are a militant, then you're someone that would be willing to commit acts of violence, and that could be damage against property or damage against people in order to try and achieve a political aim or some kind of goal. So you get militant campaigners on various different issues throughout history. We've had, militants in terms of religion, we've had militants in terms of political causes, we've had militants in terms of environmental causes, all those kind of things. And then moderate. Now, moderate is a word that has lots of different meanings, but when we're using it in politics, it means someone that's kind of in the middle, that they are not willing to kind of go to the extremes. So a moderate, someone that wouldn't be willing to use violence, would be someone that was only interested in using peaceful aims, peaceful means in order to achieve their particular aims. So obviously in this context, in this topic, militants tend to refer to the suffragettes because they were willing to use violence, and moderates tends to refer to the suffragists because they were peaceful and did not use violence. On to the suffragist tactics themselves. So suffragists, NUWSS, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, campaigned peacefully to gain the vote, and the sort of things they did includes writing letters to town councils. For example, they wrote letters to Kirkwall Town Council, which is in Scotland, obviously, to campaign for women to gain the vote. Famous suffragist Carmichael Stokes toured the north of Scotland, addressing at least a meeting a day to encourage people to sign the 1896 Special Appeal to Parliament petition, and we've talked about petitions before. Again, this is a way for people that maybe are disenfranchised, that means they don't have access to the vote, to express their opinion. They also wrote a lot of letters. Letter writing is a very important part of the suffragist campaign. So, for example, they wrote to Keir Hardie, who's a very important member of the Independent Labour Party and a very left-wing politician at the start of the 20th century. Another important suffragist tactic was being involved in kind of legal campaigns. And Crystal Macmillan, who was an Edinburgh suffragist, she graduated from Edinburgh University, and in those days, if you were a graduate of certain universities, you gained a vote. And she basically took that to court and said, well, she was an Edinburgh University graduate and she should be allowed to vote in the Edinburgh University constituency. However, she lost that campaign. The suffragettes wrote to the Shetland News to discuss women getting the vote in New Zealand. Say basically that happened long before women got the vote in Britain, and so this was again a way to keep the issue in public mind. And another Scottish suffragette called Louisa Lumsden helped organise the Suffragist Great Pilgrimage, which was a kind of march of thousands of people, men and women, down to London to protest the fact that women didn't have the vote. And Louisa Lumsden also spoke quite passionately at the final rally, which was held in London. Then to the suffragettes. Now, as we said, suffragettes were a lot more militant and a lot more willing to engage in violence. They were the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, formed in 1903, and they campaigned more actively under a slogan, deeds, not words. So they were about doing things rather than writing letters and signing petitions. So Marion Wallace Thump was arrested for her actions, and she was the first suffragette to go on hunger strike. A suffragette called Emily Green was arrested for smashing windows in Study Hall Street in Glasgow. Scottish suffragettes would also pour corrosive substances, things that would damage and destroy letters, into letterboxes in Aberdeen and postboxes in Aberdeen and Leith in Edinburgh. They cut down telegraph poles to prevent the transference of messages, and they did this in places like Barton. Burnington House, which is a very kind of famous old house in Lanark, was destroyed by a fire set by suffragettes. They also vandalised the King's portrait in the Royal Scottish Academy, which is in Edinburgh. They slashed the painting. The Scottish suffragette called Jeanette Arthur was arrested for trying to blow up Burns Cottage, which is obviously the birthplace of Robert Burns in Alloway in Ayrshire. They also tried to blow up the Kibble Palace, which is in Glasgow. And possibly the most famous suffragette action was when two suffragettes attacked the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, on a golf course in Lossiemouth, which is up in the north of Scotland. So these are all more militant, more violent actions that involve targeting people or targeting things to destroy and damage. So you can see there's a strong contrast between that and suffragists who were peaceful and suffragettes who were a lot more violent. So in the exam, there are a variety of different questions you can be asked. If it's a described question, there's a limited number of things they can ask you, so it's most likely just to be something along the lines of describe the tactics of the suffragettes or describe the tactics of the suffragists. So you only need to know 4 for that, so just 4 tactics that the suffragettes or the suffragists used. An explain question will be about the effect of these tactics. So it will be about the effect that the suffragist or the suffragette, or possibly both, campaign had on gaining the right to vote. So in the past, there's been a question that was, explain the reasons why the suffragettes harmed the cause of votes for women. So that's asking you to think about the campaign to win the vote and how suffragettes' actions, militant actions, damaged that campaign. You'd also get a question about the successes of these campaigns. So it could be something like, explain the reasons why the suffragists helped the cause of votes for women or something like that. So understanding the effect of the tactics is very important. So when you're thinking about the tactics, think about, right, what did this lead to? So why would you slash a picture in a gallery? So one of the reasons for that would be to get it into the media. But then people might think, well, these women are just, they're violent, they're destructive, and so if they're going to be violent and destructive, then they don't deserve the vote. So that's the kind of thing you need to think about when trying to understand how to answer explain questions about this topic. Now, a hopefully or evaluate question could ask you about the tactics of the suffragettes, or it could ask you about the effect the suffragists or the suffragettes. So it would be kind of similar sort of ideas to the describe or explain question, but you would obviously have to do that in the context and structure that's required of how fully and evaluate question. And finally, the 9-mark essay is a very possible question where they might ask you to explain the reasons why women gained the vote. So to what extent was the campaign of the suffragettes the main reason why women gained the vote, or to what extent was the campaign of the suffragists the main reason why women gained the vote? So they're sort of things you would have to be able to understand. So you'd have to know the effect of the kind of things that the suffragists did and the effect it had, the things that the suffragettes did and the effect it had, and then various other reasons for women gaining the vote, such as war work, or such as the fact that other countries around the world were beginning to give women the vote. So hopefully you should have a good idea of the tactics that the different groups use and be able to think about the effects that these tactics had, and this should hopefully help you kind of study and revise for the exam.